Well, I remember, it's almost 3 years ago that we first talked about the possibility of a book. And of course, in my vanity and self-importance, I thought it was all my idea, but you had already spoken to a dozen people who had said, you got to write a book. Well, the reason in my mind was he'd started collecting so many basses. It's like, I said, where are you going to put them, right? Why, in a book?
That's right, yeah. Well, you reminded me of that great quote by that comedian, Stephen Wright.
Yeah.
You know, he said, how does it go?
He's such a laconic stand-up comic. I don't know if you've ever, he goes, you can't have everything. Where would you put it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the answer is, make a book. So that's what we did. And it was interesting because for me, you know, I'm used to having Neil Peart as our literary genius in our band, and he's the book writer. And so when the idea of a book came up, it felt a bit like I was a fish out of water, but as we got rolling and as we got into the project, it seemed to make sense to do, and especially in a way to justify the mania of collecting so many interesting pieces. And I would say that the journey of collection excited me so much that I felt that putting them in a book would also excite people that didn't know as much about bass guitars. And the miracle of learning about the history of this instrument woke up an awareness of the development of modern music in terms of the bass guitar. And that was a wonderful surprise.
So on that, I remember a lunch we had way in the early days. You confessed to me that you had started a new collection, this time not of stamps, not of baseballs, but of basses. Mm. And I said to you, how many have you got? And I think it was about 40 at the time. I said, does your wife know? And there was a pause. I said, you might have to mortgage your house. And you go, well, that's a risk I'm prepared to take. And I knew he was in trouble, right? And what I immediately thought, and I'm asking you right now, is when you have your mind on a collection with no bounds, no form, no shape, how do you begin to collect it? You know, how do you put it into categories and something that ultimately is a book that's organized and has a theme?
Well, yeah, as you alluded to, I'm a collector at heart, always have been. Stamps in the early days when I was a really nerdy kid. Some would say I'm still just a really nerdy kid, a much older one. Then I moved on to vinyl. I started collecting music, and really that's what made me want to be a musician, was all these great pieces of work by my heroes. And then once I was a touring musician, I got into baseball and I started amassing a collection of baseball ephemera. And that's been ongoing for most of my life. And so after all these passions, you sort of develop a method to collecting. And there are different kinds of collectors. There are some that just want particular instruments, and that's it. And others like myself who are completists. And this is a phrase I heard from Joe Bonamassa when he came over to my house. Joe's a great collector and a friend of mine. And he was over looking at the book with me, and he said, geez, you are a completist. I don't work that way, but a completist is a guy that sees every hole in every particular area of your collection, right? So you don't see what you have, you see what's missing. And then that sets you out into the world to find that missing thing.
I have a feeling there are some rushed completists.
Yeah. So, it's a curse in a way, but it's also a marvelous sort of adventure for me.
On one of the pages, as you will see when you open the book, there's a single photograph, two-page photograph of one of Geddy's bass cases. It's a kind of a fantasy picture. We based it, there was a group called Flash once upon a time, and on the inside of one of Flash's records there was this open case, and it was supposedly the life of a rock and roller on the road. So there's a bottle of cognac, and there are backstage passes and roaches and all kinds of stuff. So we overstuffed, and if you look real closely, you'll see under a hatch a baseball, and next to a baseball glove, and it's signed by the Beatles. from their 1963, 64 Shea
I think it was
Stadium.
64 Shea Stadium.
64.
Yeah.
That's the kind of, impressive collecting. Did you have that idea in your mind? First of all, I'm going to go for the most impressive basses, the rarest beasts in the field, or was it a milder interest that became more maniacal over time?
Okay, well, just to set the stage a little bit, for my 40-odd years as an odd musician in this trio called Rush, I wasn't a collector of basses. I was a user of instruments that delivered the tone that I was searching for. I spent most of my career trying to develop an identifiable tone, and anything that didn't fit into that soundscape, I sort of pushed out of the way. So there are a lot of great basses that were manufactured through the years that I had no interest in because they didn't suit the music of Rush, and they didn't suit the sound I saw for myself. So here we are, and it's around 2012, I guess, and I get approached by a music store in Los Angeles, and they say, hey, we'd really like some sort of thing from your touring life, a bass that doesn't have to be your main bass, but something that we can put in our little Hall of Fame at the music store, and we would swap you for a vintage 1953 Fender Precision. I'm going, why do I want an old bass like that for? What am I going to do in an old bass? So I started researching it, and I went, interesting. It's from my birth year, 53. Don't tell anyone. And I realized it was only 2 years removed from the invention of the electric bass that was available for mass production by Leo Fender. And in that moment, I realized how little I knew about the instrument that I'd held in my hands for 42 years. I knew very little about its evolution. I knew very little about the people that made them, why they made them out of the materials that they made them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that struck me as, that's dangerous for me, because I was getting curious. So I said to Scully, my tech, I said, maybe it would be fun to collect about a dozen basses, each one representing a different icon I had as a bass player. So for example, an EB3 that like Jack Bruce used to play, or, a Rickenbacker 4001S like Chris Squire used to play, a Hofner Cavern like Macca played. So that's how it started. But that's just not how I roll, so that led to more curiosity and more gaps that needed to be filled until I got completely fascinated with what I call, and what Terry Foster, who's a Leo Fender expert and a writer of a book called Fender the Golden Age, I got introduced to the golden age of guitar making, and that was really a fascinating trip for me. And so that's how it started, and that's how we ended up here in Calgary today.
It wasn't until we started working on this that I'd ever actually heard you talking about instruments. I mean, not just the bass. And in that respect, you reminded me of my dad, who I remember once when I was really an angry teenager, my brother and him cornered him in a restaurant and said, "You never tell us how much money you make. You never tell us how you make it. What do you do?" He said, "It's none of your goddamn business how much money I make. As for what I do, there's 26 letters in the alphabet. I jumble them up." So with you, like talking to you about music was death, because you're so disciplined and private about it. There was this inner musical life. As you started to collect these instruments, you started to have to think aloud more, I think, about the unmentionables, the theory of music, practice of music, and how your playing features in the instruments. How has your relationship to the instruments changed since you've done this project?
Well, I appreciate them for what they are. Not having to make them fit into the Rush soundscape made me be able to look at them more objectively, and understand why other bass players that I admire who would play a Gibson Thunderbird, for example, or why did guys choose these other basses that to me just sounded wrong? Well, now that the shackles of that that concept were broken open for me. So I could look at each instrument for what they were. And the more I learned about certain companies' history, like Gibson and Hofner, and how they were really rooted in crafting fine instruments for many, many, many years. And so you see their story develop, and then you see how brazen Leo Fender was by daring to sort of invent the mass production assembly line, which is how Fender Instruments first started. And who would think that the development of these instruments coincide with the development of modern popular music? And the more you know about an instrument and who played them, the more you understand the music that we love and how it came to be. And the role that the bass plays in all of that is quite profound. So I started welling with pride about my instrument and its storied past, and getting to know other players better was really fantastic and informative to me.
Because you impressed me by always referring to your instrument as just a tool of the trade, as like a hoe, or a rake.
Right.
And
well, Les Claypool has the best expression. He calls it a four-string piece of furniture.
You threw me off. I forgot what I was going to ask. But as you started collecting these things, and some of them weren't just tools; they were really art objects, weren't they? They were aesthetically beautiful and not immediately playable. But that didn't put you off.
Well, I noticed a few things. First of all, there was no book out there that was a compendium of a variety of kinds of bass guitars. And the bass guitar books that I did find were all sort of pamphlet-y. They were sort of giveaways almost, So I just thought there's something missing here. There are beautiful books on vintage guitars, six-string guitars, but nothing for the bass. I thought, well, this is just wrong. This is a wrong that has to be righted. And also, as we start, yes. And also the contours and the shapes of some of them. I mean, some of the ones that I found in Italy, for example, or in Sweden, are just eccentric and in their own way gorgeous little pieces of mid-century art. So I thought these need to be photographed and photographed properly, which brought me to my friend and our colleague on this project, Richard Sibbald, who is an incredible photographer and has had a really interesting history in terms of training him from shooting people live to doing product photography to he does all kinds of things.
So he could make roadkill look beautiful.
Yeah. And so when I decided to undertake this, we got together and he was all up for it, and my wife very kindly donated her art studio, which is in the top floor of my home, and she paints. So she said, "Well, you there's good light up there. You should use that." And we said, "Okay." She assumed it would be for a few weeks, and so Richard moved up there, and all that beautiful light he covered. Blocked all out. He brought mountains of lights and reflectors, and he set up 3 different stations in her room because these guitars, different brands have different contours, and you can't shoot every bass from the same angle. Sometimes that distorts the shape of the body, and sometimes just doesn't show off how beautiful it is. And so there we were, 8 months later, still shooting. And my wife was like, I like Richard and everything, but so yeah, we ended up with 30,000 photographs, and we had to.
Then we had to go through them all.
Yeah, we had to go through them all and put them in a book form. And Daniel and I assembled the first manuscript, and he described how he painstakingly researched each instrument, and it was very important to him and to me that the book's tone be conversational like this. We wanted the book to feel like I'm talking to you guys about bass guitars as I am right now. And so we assembled the first manuscript and sent it into our editor at HarperCollins, and she said 3 things. She said, first of all, I've never seen a book that plays out on the page with such passion. Secondly, the photography is absolutely stunning. And thirdly, I've never seen a manuscript that was 845 pages before. I said, so that's a bad thing? She said, well, I don't think we're going to make a book that big. So that became part of my education in bookmaking. And I went to New York and spent 2 weeks working at the office of HarperCollins with their wonderful design staff, teaching me how to painfully take out photographs.
How to drown your puppies.
How to drown my puppies. Yeah, it was painful. But in the end, it was necessary, obviously. I would like the book to have been a little bigger, but as you can see, the thing you're carrying on your lap is probably heavy enough, right? Anyway, so that's how the book came to be.
You briefly mentioned before the innovation of Leo Fender, the mass production line, as opposed to the luthier workshop tradition of companies like Gibson. But I'm interested to know what else you feel that you learned about the history of bass, because I remember once looking at your baseball collection and you saying, it's not just I'm greedily like a dragon, hoarding all these beautiful baseballs. For me, the collection is a window onto history,
yes,
onto American history, onto American culture, both sports and political and beyond. What more things do you feel now that you've learned about bass?
Well, I mean, it's about instrument making, and it's about how that is an expression of the culture at the time. One thing I didn't realize at the time was how dramatically the Beatles changed everything. People were making these really interesting, high-quality instruments, and then around 1964, the demand started to rise. The more popular the Beatles got in the British invasion, the more demand there were. Everybody wanted to be a guitar player or a drummer or a bass player suddenly, and all these companies, they couldn't keep up with the demand. And so quality started to wane. Things started to change. So that was a really fascinating thing to me. And to see how it changed in companies in Germany, in companies in Sweden, in companies in Italy, and of course in America. And that's led us to 1965 when Leo Fender finally sold the company to CBS. So there's that whole, Beatlemania and the effect that it had. And in a sense, the way my friend Terry Foster puts it, the Beatles killed the vintage guitar world in a sense,
Sounds harsh.
It sounds harsh, but it's kind of true. But anyway, so that's one aspect. But also, I had no idea that there were these companies in Italy that had manufactured
accordions,
for all these years. And they decided they wanted to jump on the bandwagon of popular music, and they started making guitars. And then you'd see these guitars that have these push buttons, like an accordion. And so there was a real connecting point between what they used to be and what they were making now. And then you'd go into companies like Hofner or Gibson, and you see the detail and the kind of wood that they chose. And you pick Gibson for an example, and they were based in an area of Michigan that was known for making fine furniture, where there were a lot of German and other European immigrants moving there to make furniture. And those carpenters or woodworkers, or what you want to call them, became the new luthiers. And so they were based on a tradition of carpentry that goes back years and years, whereas Leo Fender and the California crew, here you just stick this neck onto this body, and when it wears out, they just pop it off and replace it. He had no idea that these instruments would last as long as they did and have become so profound. So every country has a story, and collecting is a window into a culture that I find, irresistible.
There's another thing that I've hadn't really occurred to me until we did this thing, and Terry Foster writes about it in his introduction as well, which is that without the bass, really there would not have been rock and roll, not the way we know it. It's what you might call technological determinism. Mm-hmm. The invention of the electric bass was first of all kind of scoffed at by serious jazz purists, for example. They looked at this plank and called it a toy. They laughed at it at the original trade shows, right? But then eventually, first of all, there weren't proper amps for it, so then maybe that was part of the reason, even though the idea was it was supposed to be now an instrument you could hear with everything else. But the thing was that suddenly you could have a power trio, something never possible in the history of. And I'm fascinated by the way, like the microphone invented, made Frank Sinatra possible, a crooner who could sing like this into your ear. Never happened before.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool, and I think there's a lot of effort in the book, and this is my question, really. How deep did you want to go into technical description? Because we have a certain amount of nuts and bolts.
Well, the technical stuff must be there for those people that find that interesting, but I tried to put it in a way that sort of took the piss out of itself in a way. Like the original version of the book, we wanted to put all those technical details in what we called nerd bubbles. I didn't want to impose this information on the casual reader, but nonetheless, it is important to those that value those instruments. And if you're a collector or a player and you want to look up, a Dan Electro from 1959, you want to know what all those parts were and what, all the stuff that can be written off as nerdy is essential to the instrument. So we tried to find a balance, and I think we successfully did, where you can flip through that book and just look at the pretty pictures, or you can dive in to the little bubbles and captions and find out, exactly why the Fender bass was so remarkable in 1951. That's the thing I come back to. I imagine myself being a double bass player in the late 40s and early 50s, and always having to struggle. Where is this effing thing going to go? It has to be tied to the roof of the car, or, you get there on your own. We'll see you at the gig. And then miraculously, here's this portable thing that hangs off your shoulder. And also it has these things called frets. And that means you can get it perfectly in tune.
With precision.
Yeah, and hence the name precision bass, yeah. So anyway, those are the things I think about, and those are the bits of minutia that I think even a casual reader would find interesting.
Yeah, because it's like, Walk on the Wild Side. What we discovered as we were doing the analysis of all these instruments was that Herbie Flowers, who did that track, actually played that doom, 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 doom on two basses, the upright bass and the electric bass. Yeah. And then we discovered there's this whole Nashville tradition called tic-tac, where they would record one for the punch and one for the warmth. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating how,
It is to us. I don't know if
it is to us, anyway. Can I ask you, I'd like to ask you a question about the writing of the book. So we wrestled a little bit about the writing of it. And one of the challenges, even frustrations I found at the start, was you speak, or at least you did at the very beginning of this book, as a musician. So I would say, how does this Rickenbacker feel? Great. Okay, great. Let's write it down. Great. And then we go to the Hofner. How did this one feel? It's a great sounding bass. So I actually got out the thesaurus and I wrote 45 words that would be alternatives to great.
Yes.
But what I realized was I'm talking to a musician, and you said, Dan, that's how musicians talk.
Yeah, it's true. Daniel would say to me, you are not allowed to use the word beautiful or great anymore. You have to think of some other way that actually gives someone an idea of what the tone of the instrument is, which was a great challenge, and it had us going up and down the stairs into my studio and plugging these things in, which is also one of the great joys of having a collection like this, because you have the amazing ability, and very few people have this. I can take 20 years of the development of a jazz bass and play them back to back to back to back to back to back, and notice all that minutia, notice what has changed. Same player, same amp, 20 years worth of instruments. So that became such a joy for me. When a new instrument came into the house, a new old instrument, I got to analyze it, and I got to see what it really was made of and compare them in ways that someone that doesn't have good fortune to have all these basses has. So, you know, it forced us to be more precise with our descriptors too.
Certainly one of the great privileges I felt that I had spending time with you on this was those moments where I would lie on the sofa in his basement studio, blindfolded kind of thing, and he would say, okay, which is this? And he'd play, and then unplug, click, 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 and might pretend to be playing a different one, but actually, I mean, you were going through all the dynamics of the instrument. One morning, this dude starts jamming on And a Mermaid or a Merman I Shall Be from Hendrix's Electric Ladyland. He's just playing a bass, but it's like he's playing all the instruments with the overtones and the clicking and the... Oh, man. I just thought I could die and go home. I thought that
You're
was
just
great.
easily impressed, that's all.
Anyway, you know, he knows his instrument. So here's what I wanted to ask. What I thought was one of the big challenges of the book was why a book in the age of the internet when you can look everything up on Dr. Google? You know, how is this going to stand out or offer something different?
Well, you know, there's a lot of misinformation floating around the net, as we discovered in researching this book. You can't always rely on what you Google search. So, and I think there's something to having sort of taking an authoritative tone on it. And when you have all these instruments in your hands and you can speak about them knowledgeably and create a compendium that really can be a guide to other like-minded, crazy individuals that want to buy a bass. You know, I kept thinking of a young kid who might come across a bass in a store and go, wow, what's that bass all about? Well, he can look it up. He can find out what it's all about and see what it's supposed to look like, what the color's supposed to look like. So I saw it not only as this romantic, you know, discovery into my instrument, but also a useful, you know, reference point.
Beyond your own collection, there are also moments with other bass players, and you traveled around, you went as far as Australia to meet other bass players. You will find in the book chats between Geddy and John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin, for example. Absolutely a superb array of musicians talking about their basses. Did you have any fanboy moments?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, you know, it was my great privilege to talk to some of these players who I really admired. John Paul Jones, for example, who's, you know, is the sweetest guy on the planet Earth, too, I might add. He wouldn't even let me pay for his taxi to my apartment. He's just a lovely guy, and he speaks so well, and if you read his interview, you get a sense how lovely he is. And informative. So there was a moment where we were getting ready to take his picture, and you know he had the famous 62 jazz bass that he played on all the early Zepp records with him, and his very first bass. You know, by the way, he's the only guy that I interviewed when I sent a little letter and requested your favorite and your first bass. He actually brought them. He actually paid attention, so he read the letter. So, but as we're waiting for the lights to be ready, he starts playing Heartbreaker.
He's just noodling.
Just playing Heartbreaker.
Like a kid in a basement.
And we're all sitting around going, he's playing Heartbreaker. And then we say, well, can I hold the bass? And he goes, sure. And he picks up the other bass, and I'm holding the Heartbreaker bass, you know, I'm holding the communication breakdown bass, the immigrant song bass, you know. So that was a great thrill for me. And the other, I mean, I should explain that when it came to doing these interviews, I could have talked to 100 bass players, and all of them would have been so interesting and fun. But I chose bass players that really connected with what the book is about. Rather than talk to just great players, I wanted people that were either collectors themselves or were around during the Golden Age and knew what it was like to go buy a bass in 1961 in London. Or, do you know what I mean? And some of these guys were iconic in their own right, but also contribute to the story of the bass. So one of these gentlemen was Bill Wyman. The very first band I wanted to join when I was a kid, the song you had to play to prove you were a bass player was 2120 South Michigan Avenue by the Rolling Stones. So really that was one of the first riffs that got me a gig. So he was iconic, and also he pretty much invented the electric fretless bass. And he's a fascinating character. So he agreed to meet Daniel and I at a restaurant in London. And it was the very first interview. So here is the first time I'm on the other side, right, interviewing him. And I was a bit nervous, and Dan was him having interviewed zillions of people through the years, he was coaching me.
I was nervous too.
Yeah. But, and Bill wants to talk about anything but basses. So he seriously is a fascinating individual. He's written 9 books. He's an amateur archaeologist. He's invented his own metal detector. I mean, he's a butterfly photographer, for Christ's sake. I mean, this guy is interested in everything.
Except basses.
Yeah, so you don't want to talk about basses. It's like, well, I kind of do.
That fucking bass.
I kind of do, yeah. He kept saying, look at my hands. Look how small my hands are. I said, you want to know why I play basses? I played small basses because I got small hands. What else do you need to know? So he was a trip, and every guy that I chose to interview in one way or another were a trip and were really fun, and I could have done 100 of them. It was, and their stories are very revealing. I think one of the nicest parts of the book. So
I have 100 more questions to ask, but it's only fair to give you guys a chance. And there are a couple of floating mics about, so it's hard to see, but if you might put up a hand and then someone will thrust a mic into it.
Okay. First of all, Mr. Lee, I really love your music.
Thank you very much.
You are a great guy. We all love you so much.
Thank you.
So the question I have for you is, if you could go back in time and you meet yourself before you became this big, famous, awesome, badass rock star, would you believe that you came this far?
Oh, hell no.
Okay.
I still can't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a really lucky human being. I got to work with like 2 of the greatest people that anyone could work with in a rock band. How do you stay in a rock band together for 42 years? You got to be good guys or it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. And I can count on one hand the number of arguments that we had over those years. So I'm very privileged. I had great partners, and partners that were inspired to play at their peak at all times. And so nobody expects that a career is going to be long. When I first started, man, I never thought I would be on tour again. And the first tour we did, I kept a key to every hotel room I stayed in. I literally have a bag of keys at home. I thought I'm never going to get back to, Louisville, Kentucky again. So anyway, no, thanks for your question, but I never expected this to work out so well.
You talked about holes in your collection. What's the Holy Grail for you that you still don't have?
That's a good question. Okay, so I found a few Holy Grails, and actually after the book went to press, I found a couple more, which is a real pisser. Yeah, but there are still a few elusive colors that I've never found. There's some early Rickenbackers I'm still looking for. I really want a first-year Rickenbacker 4001. I have, and you can see it out there, there's a 1964, which is sort of a third year. So it's essentially the same instrument, but not exactly. And what you'll see out there when you look at some of the instruments, and it's particularly interesting about Rickenbacker basses, they made so few basses every year. Even at their peak, they were not huge, producers of instruments. And in their early years, they made very, very few. And you can see 2, and I tell the story in the book. I have 2 from 1960 that are only 4 serial numbers apart from each other. But the angle of the neck is completely different. The shape of the body is different. So you can see that they were experimenting with every instrument they made. And I find that really fascinating. So if you see an early Rickenbacker, it's in a way it's a prototype.
Oh, also the floral.
Yes,
telly.
and I'm looking, as Dan likes to remind me, I never found a 1968 blue floral Telecaster bass. When you go upstairs, you'll see its counterpart, which is a 1968 Paisley. And for some reason, they're as rare as they are, they're still easier to find than a blue floral. So it's eluded me all these years, and I'm still looking. I'll find one.
Hi, Mr. Lee.
Hi.
I'm very nervous.
Me too.
I'm an old Jane and Finch boy.
All right.
Yeah, musician as well. But I was wondering, when you transformed from playing in a bar to a stadium with 50,000, did it change how you perceived it all, or was it just another show?
No, it's a good question, thank you. It's quite a different environment, and that's why some bands succeed making the transition from bar band to stadium band. It is a really different thing. In a bar, you're very contained, the sound is very controlled, you've got all this little detail, and then suddenly you're in this cavern. And you're opening for, in our case, it was Uriah Heep, and you have 26 minutes to play. And so somehow in those 26 minutes, you have to get on there and impress all these people that are milling about finding their seats that don't know who you are, and in fact, you're so loud that you're irritating them as they try to find their seats. So it's a big jump, it's a big leap, and that's why it takes years of being an opening act to get it down. Thanks.
I was just wondering, I've noticed a lot of basses have a thumb rest below the strings, and that seems very common. And I'm just wondering, why is it there? Why not above the strings? And what kind of play style was it for?
Well, that's a good question. We spend a lot of time in our nerdy moments talking about thumb rests. Why? It's so dumb, but one of the things that fascinates me is they're called thumb rests, they're called finger rests, they're called tug bars. In the early days, they were called tug bars. Why? Because the style of music that was being played was, as Daniel alluded to, tic-tac music, and there were the things called mutes on a bass. Why? Because they deadened the sound for this honky-tonk type of bass playing. That was the style. So, as my mother would say, it's the style. So they called it a tug bar because you put your fingers below and they played with their thumbs. So, of course, it was outdated almost instantly. And you'll see in later versions from the 70s on, they moved it above, but it just looks so weird above. So
You're supposed to rest your thumb.
You're supposed to rest your thumb for your fingers, and really that makes more sense. But it just looks out of place there. So I like it down there where it stays out of the way, and I just use it. I use the strings as a tug bar in a sense, and just anchor myself off that. Or as you can see, one of the basses upstairs, you'll see where my thumbs hang out because all the paint is worn away from those spots. So thanks for the question.
Curious, since writing the book, have you heard from other musicians? And are any of those, have you heard from musicians that you didn't interview and you sort of had a pinch me moment where they've contacted you and said, oh, I love the bass book? I was reading an article the other day, Tina Weymouth from the Talking Heads, and they were asking her what's her favorite book currently. She goes, oh, that Geddy Lee book, it's amazing. So I'm just curious if you've heard from other musicians now that the book is out.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I have heard from a ton of musicians, and Tina was really, she's wonderful. And when we were getting close to the end of the writing, I realized there was so many great players that were not represented that have contributed to the history of this instrument and the history of the bass in popular music. And so I reached out to a lot of them, and Tina was one of them, because she played a Hofner, and what was it like to play a Hofner? Give me some quotes about your playing. And they were so...
It sounded great.
They were so... Well, I can't follow that. Anyway, she's a wonderful person. Gail Ann Dorsey, Martin Turner from Wishbone Ash, all kinds of people have reached out to me and have been happy about the book. I'm really gratified that so many people like it, and I appreciate all the work we put in. So thanks.